Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the world. My name is Zach Jones, but a lot of you probably already know who I am. Welcome back to my channel, but if you're new to my channel, then welcome. A few weeks back I did this PowerPoint on 5 wolves of the world, but I've decided to go back to this PowerPoint because there's a fair bit I didn't cover. Now, I've chosen 5 wolves because there's more than one species of wolf. In fact, wolves are the largest wild members of the dog family, and they come in many different kinds, but I've chosen 5 wolves. And the first one I'm going to start with is the voice of the wilderness and one of the most incredible animals in the world. It is the grey wolf. Now, wolves have unfortunately had a very bad reputation for many generations, and that's mainly down to us because they've featured heavily in human myths and folklores as the bad guys. And in many stories, wolves always play the villain, often portrayed as sly, cunning, sadistic murderers. And of course, there's also the horror stories of werewolves, which are people who turn into wolves. And this has marked a deep-rooted fear and hatred of wolves, which I think is incredibly unfair, because this animal's playful and curious nature does not agree with these stories of a solitary, sadistic, murderous killer. Grey wolves are one of the most widespread large predators in the world, and they're also, of course, they come in different colours, like depending on what the wolf calls home, from midnight black, snowy white, or many shades in between. In fact, wolves actually have the second greatest distinguish of colour, second only to humans. And one of the reasons why I think wolves are such incredible animals is that they live and hunt together in communities called packs. Packs can often subsist of like 10 to 12 wolves, but some can be as big as 20 or 25. And it's more than just a family unit, it's a sophisticated hunting group. And they're always led by the alpha pair, which are usually the parent wolves, and the other members of the pack are usually their offspring from previous seasons. And another thing that I always have liked about wolves is how they bring themselves together, particularly before a hunt, and that's by using a howl. And of course, that's one of the things grey wolves are most well known for, is their howl. Because a howl from a wolf can be heard from over 10 miles away. It serves as both a way to rally the pack before a hunt, but also to serve as a warning to rival packs to keep their distance. It's essentially the wolf way of sending a text or an email. Unlike humans, wolves are digitigree, which means they walk on their toes, which allows them to move quietly, and also where they're found, because these wolves are found anywhere from green forests to rugged mountains, grasslands, or the snowy tundra, where they're found pretty much everywhere. And another thing that has always amazed me about wolves is how they are able to take on prey many times their own size. In Europe, it can be red deer, but in North America, that's either elk, moose, or incredibly bison. In fact, there's actually a remote corner of the planet in northern Canada where the wolves hunt bison, as they have done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And of course, I've actually got the skull of a grey wolf, and of course when you look at a grey wolf skull, you notice that the teeth are very, very long. In fact, we're talking about an animal that is a lot larger than an Alsatian or a German Shepherd and has a bite force that's more than 5 times more powerful. And of course, the canine teeth are quite often used by wolves in hunting. If they're hunting large prey like bison, they bite at the thighs and lower legs of their prey, and that can leave a 6-inch gash, and then the wolf just has to pull back and wait for the animal to bleed to death. But also, the teeth around the side of the mouth, the jaw, are called carnassials, or cheek teeth, and they're what are used to bite into bone. Now, if you ever see a dog getting stuck into a bone, it'll quite often bring it round to the side of its mouth and crunch away at it, rather than use its front teeth, as they're far too brittle for that. But also, that's another way wolves bring down prey, is a thing. They bite down on the throat, and that can quite often crush the windpipe, open blood vessels that carry blood to the brain, and that can cause their prey to suffocate in probably just a minute. And another thing about the wolf skull is that at the back of the skull, where the neck muscles join the skull, they're actually very, very large, and they serve purpose for when they feed. And when wolves make a kill, you quite often have 5 or 6 animals all competing for food, so they'll get their teeth stuck into it and they'll brace back with their huge paws on straight legs and just shake their heads from side to side to tear out chunks of meat. And a lot of you are probably thinking what wolves hunt. I mean, in North America, where they live in Yellowstone, which is the oldest national park in the world, the wolves there hunt mainly elk, which are a very large species of deer, and they're also the North American version of the red deer in Europe. And in Yellowstone, elk are the main prey source that the wolves are looking for, particularly in the winter, because the elk are at a very considerable disadvantage because they have to break down through the snow in order to get at the leaves and also to munch on the conifer trees, a lot of which don't have an awful lot of nutrition in them. So as the winter goes on, the elk are just getting weaker and weaker and weaker, all the more ripe pickings for the wolves. And that's where their pack hunting comes into advantage, or comes into use. Because how they do it is the lightest and fastest wolves will start the chase, while others circle around their prey to both cut off any escape routes and wait to take over when the others tire. And of course, before wolves actually hunt prey, they track it using smell, because wolves have probably one of the strongest sense of smell of any animal, second only to bears. And of course, the part of their brain that processes smell is much more developed than ours. In fact, it's said to be 8,000 times more powerful than a human being's. And quite often when their prey is moving along, dead skin and hair cells fall off and land on the ground, and of course even their footsteps leave a scent, and wolves then take long, deep sniffs to process the scent, and that's where they can determine if the animal is young, old, weak, injured or sick. And of course, back to the hunting, when the wolves are hunting, they usually target an animal a member of the herd that's usually young, old, weak, sick or injured, and they separate it from the herd. And once they've got their target alone and vulnerable, the whole pack will charge in. And of course, Wolves can also run for longer periods of time than their prey because they have huge hearts and lungs that can drive them on at the same speed as an Olympic sprinter, but they have incredible stamina and they can keep up the chase for longer periods, and once their prey is exhausted, the whole pack will pile in and go in and finish it off. And while it is a gruesome end for an elk, a moose or a bison, it ultimately assures that the rest of the herd remains strong, their weaker members falling prey to one of the world's top predators. Of course, once wolves have made a kill, that's when you actually get to see that there's usually a fair amount of fighting among them, and that's mainly when the alpha dog, the alpha male, has to prove why he's the boss, because he has to assert himself on a kill and make sure, and he gets the best bits of meat, and he has to show everyone who's the boss. Grey wolves were, many years ago, they were once probably the most widespread land predator, but unfortunately when human settlers moved into their territories and cut down a lot of the forests and grasslands they lived in to make way for farms and animals, conflict then began. And of course, when a lot of their natural prey was depleted by farmers and ranchers, the wolves ended up going for livestock like sheep and cows, and that might have been in retaliation against their prey being taken. And of course, that was when people began killing wolves. In Britain, they were hunted to extinction. They were wiped out in large parts of Europe. And in North America, even worse, more than 1 million grey wolves were shot, poisoned and trapped. In fact, by the middle of the last century, grey wolves had been exterminated from much of their range and pushed them into the wilds of Canada. But fortunately, attitudes changed, because in the 1970s, grey wolves were classed as an endangered species and efforts were made to bring them back. Because in North America, in the 1990s, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park for the first time since the 1920s, and they managed to bring the park back into balance, well, the ecosystem back in balance, and slowly wolves have been reintroduced mostly from Canada back to the United States, and there are now more than 12,000 of them in the United States. They've slowly spread back to the rest of Europe, and probably the best place in Europe to see them is the Carpathian Mountains in Romania. And while there are some talks about bringing them back to Scotland, while I do think that would be a good idea to bring them back to the Caledonian forests to keep deer population in balance, I'm not entirely sure if it might be such a great idea, but that's a debate for another day. Thanks to the reintroduction and human reasoning, the grey wolf is starting to make a comeback. Here is the range of the grey wolf. Now, the next wolf I'm going to show you is probably the rarest and most threatened member of the dog family. It is the Ethiopian or Abyssinian wolf. Now, this wolf is, as its name suggests, found in Ethiopia in East Africa, where it is endemic, which means it's found there and nowhere else on Earth. But over the last few decades, it's been under tremendous pressure. In fact, it's suffered from hunting, habitat loss, and most recently from disease. And it's now meant that there's probably no fewer than 500 individuals left in the wild, so it's teetering on the edge of extinction. Of course, the Ethiopian wolf is a very different character to its